Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Charlotte Bennett. And Charlotte is an expert on the oil pipelines. And Charlotte is going to talk about the fact that a lot of the conflicts in this world stem from the oil pipelines. So, Charlotte, you've got the floor.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia. Um, you, what I have written is a book, Follow the Pipelines,
Mm.
and there's a map on it underneath, which is very key to understanding what's going on in the Middle East. It shows three different pipelines, and one of them is, well, there's the projected Trans-Arabian pipeline. And this is taken from probably 1940, around 47, I think. This map was done, envisioning a pipeline that takes Saudi oil to the Mediterranean Sea. In this case, it was envisioned to end in northern Lebanon. Some people wanted it to end in Haifa, Israel, then Palestine. Now, why do I know this and why am I focusing on this? It all goes to my trying to figure out what happened to my father. Um, what happened to my father when he died in a plane crash in March 1947. I was 6 weeks old then. And so I grew up without a father. I had a wonderful mother and a sort of a second mother who took care of me. But at any rate, it wasn't until I became a journalist in the Middle East, and this was in the early 70s in Lebanon, right before the Civil War broke out. And I started thinking that, hey, I'm back in the Middle East. I was born in Beirut, then at 6 weeks old was taken to the US and lived in Winchester, Mass, up until 63. And then my mother said, hey, I got a job at the American Community School in Beirut. Do you want to come with me? I said, yes, take me. And so that was an incredible experience. And then she died in 1972 at a time when I was finishing up a master's degree in art history of all things. I was in Florida. And after she died, I thought I'd go back to the Middle East, which I did. And I was there right before the Civil War broke out, and I got it into an incident where I was in a service car, that's like a communal taxi, and suddenly I see this tanker barreling down the street, and everyone was freaked out about it. What's this about? And we all got out, we all left, and I took refuge in a little Christian school and was on my belly most of the time as I was watching parents coming, dodging bullets, literally, to rescue their children. And then I finally got out of that situation at the school, and some relative had seen me there, and he came back and he said, hey, you got to make a decision. Either you got to get out of here or there's going to be a curfew and you have no idea who's going to occupy this school. If you want to come with me, I'll get you out of here. So I went with him. And as we were heading towards his car, we were shot at. And I'll never forget it, my hand gripping him. Obviously, they missed. He took me to safety. And I stayed at his uncle's house. And another interesting thing happened. The uh, the uncle said, "What are you doing?" Because as soon as I got into a safe environment, I started reporting. I started writing out my article for the Daily Star, and he said he thought I was a spy, and he put me on the spot and said, "You have to tell me what side you're on." So I did a quick calculation of where this house was, and I knew there were a lot of Palestinians living in this area, and including refugee camps. So my instinct was to tell the truth, but the truth was I was on the side of the Palestinians because I had seen all the repression against them when I was living in Lebanon and Palestine. Israel's right to the south of us. So back to the pipeline issue, I started to, after becoming a journalist, I started thinking about what was my father doing and so on. So fast forward, I did a lot of investigating. I sued the CIA for documents, and but some of the documents that I relied on were very easy to find. One is from the New York Times. I have it right here. There's a map there. This was on March 2nd, 1947. It says pipeline for US adds to Middle East issues. And then the subtitle is Oil Concessions Raise Questions Involving Position of Russia. Now I got to tell you, this is an incredibly valuable article, very insightful. And the most important insight from this article, dated March 2, 1947, is where it says protection of that investment, that's a Saudi pipeline, and the military and economic inevitability. No, sorry, military and economic security that will inevitably become one of the prime objectives of American foreign policy in this area, which has already become a pivot of world politics and one of the main focal points of rivalry between East and West. And then it goes in, talks about the pipeline, how it's going to affect Russia, how it's going to affect other Europeans. I mean, when you read this, you're thinking, hey, the same stuff's going on now, right now, with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, which I can link through pipelines, by the way. So anyway, this got me off and running, and then I got into my father's papers. And one of the things that were declassified, a lot of OSS documents are declassified, and they exist in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Anyway, so I was able to get a lot of his reports. One of the ones that was really interesting, and this one I got through my FOIA CIA lawsuit, was a document called Analysis of Work. It was sort of him reporting back on his marching orders, what he understood. He was going into Lebanon. His role was to spy. He was tapped as an expert in counterintelligence. So he belonged to the X2 part of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's first intelligence agency. And he wrote that among American interests that he had to protect was Saudi oil. And there's a line, this document that I got is heavily redacted, but there's a line they missed, which said, the oil of Saudi Arabia is so important that it must be protected at all costs. Now, I have discovered that this is a meme, at all costs, that goes all the way up to the present, is used often as an excuse to invade, dominate. And I came to realize that oil companies and their owners are very much responsible for all the conflict and chaos in the Middle East. It's sowing divisions, using divide and rule as a occupational priority. Now we've got Netanyahu's right-wing government sort of claiming that Jews have right to the entire land of Palestine, and that excuse me, and that the Palestinians should be ejected, maybe sent into settlements in the Sinai. Now, one thing that I've done is link the horrors of Gaza with an underlying competition and actually cooperation on protecting oil resources. There were a lot of natural gas was discovered off the coast of Gaza in 2000 and part of Israel. And then a much larger reserve of natural gas was found off the coast of Israel. And so what we've got is $500 billion worth of oil and natural gas off the Mediterranean coast. And there's also more in Gaza, and more has been found in the West Bank. Now, so why do I focus on this? Because of what I discovered about all the intrigues that went back to 1947 and got my father killed in a plane crash after a top secret mission to Saudi Arabia. I came to learn it was all about competition for oil. That's why my subtitle, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. Deadly indeed. And I discovered that oil companies, they're competing heavily, constantly with other great powers, even our allies. That's another thing I learned. Our supposed allies during World War II became vicious competitors right after, and they were targeting the U.S., doing anything to undermine the U.S. so they could get their hands on oil in the Middle East. So anyway, what did I cover? I think I covered enough. This is what I found.
I do
Lots
have
of
a
intrigue.
question. I do have a
You get,
question.
yeah.
Before the Second World War, Israel, the Jewish people had no homeland. So when they settled in Israel, I mean, let's say for the sake of peace and kumbaya, that the Second World War never happened. Where would the Jewish people go, and would that land today be all for Palestinians?
Yeah, whoa. That's a big one, Cynthia. Um, what I want to do is to give you a geopolitical context around the creation of the state of Israel. Um, and one way I came upon that was I followed the pipelines back to the that incredible map in the New York Times of 1947. It's here. You'll have to go back and look at it. March 1947. But it showed three pipelines. And these got reproduced on the cover of my book. I was focusing on the Trans-Arabian pipeline because that was what my father was focusing on at the time of his death. He visited the whole operation in Saudi Arabia and then he wrote about it. But it also shows two other pipelines. There's a fork, and they're carrying oil from Iraq. And the northern pipeline is to Jordan, and the southern ends in Haifa, Palestine. So then when I saw those pipes, well, I began to wonder, when were those built? They were built in the 1930s. But when were they conceived, right? And that goes back to prior World War I. The sorry for being hoarse. I'm still recovering from
Oh
some kind of
boy.
virus that had me down for a week. um, the Iraq Petroleum Pipeline, um, owned by the Iraq Petroleum Company. And so when was it conceived? Well, it had to be conceived during, even before World War I, because Winston Churchill in 1911 stated that he was then First Lord of the Admiralty, and he said the British warships are having a change in the source of their fuel. We're going to use oil instead of coal, and he did that because oil was more efficient in running a master battleship, and it was cheaper. So he saw where the winds were blowing. He said ruefully that that Britain had all the coal it needed, but it didn't have oil. So he predicted that Britain would have to fight on many fronts to secure oil. And well, he called it, he had to fight on a sea of troubles. But that sea of troubles, as I discovered, was all about who was going to control the oil of the Middle East after victory in World War One. And the US was definitely involved. They were all competing. But now we have to look at the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which has been cited as the basic underlying recognition of a Jewish homeland. And this was the decision that it was really the Balfour Declaration. It's just a letter. It's a letter from Lord Balfour, who used to be the foreign minister, top foreign minister of Britain. And he was writing it to Walter Rothschild. Walter Rothschild, part of the huge Rothschild oil and finance industry. So they knew what the stakes were in 1917. They knew that Churchill had said that getting the oil of Iraq was, quote, a first-class war aim. And if you follow the British troops and how they routed the Turks out of the Middle East and with some Arab help, were able to go all the way to Iraq and seize it and seize the oil. So Britain got its oil. And the next question is, how are they going to get it to market? And the obvious way would be to have it go to a terminal point in the Mediterranean. So this puts the creation of a Jewish state in a new context. And there are Israeli researchers who have been able to get into some declassified documents in Jerusalem in the archives. And they're looking at the fact that having a European, um, essentially colony, right, of European Jews in the Middle East, in Palestine. And the idea was that they had a common Judeo-Christian heritage. They could rely more on the Jews to protect the region militarily and to protect the oil. So that is a whole nother analysis. Now, did the Jews suffer terribly because of the war and the genocide? Of course. Were they turned down when they wanted to emigrate to the United States? Yes, they were. And so, and in other places. So there was a big momentum to have this homeland established in Palestine. And, you know, there was huge sympathy for the Jews at the time. But interestingly enough, at the same time that my father was writing in a document, 1944 document, before he heads to Lebanon, there were Jewish refugees who had survived and had migrated down to Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. And when a whole group assembled in Palestine, and they had a slogan. And the slogan was, "No blood for oil." That's 1944. They understood there were oil interests involved in the establishment of a Jewish state. And they also knew that in 1943, the Roosevelt administration was asked by a leader of the Jewish resistance. He was asked to bomb Auschwitz, the killing machines. And that would stop the mass murder and hopefully open the camps and allow Jews safe refuge. But where? The idea was they're going to go to Palestine. Actually, John McCoy, who was head of the U.S. Air Force, refused. Said he wouldn't bomb Auschwitz, he said, because it was a diversion away from their U.S. Tactics, bombing the neighboring oil and energy giant, which is just escaped my head. It's so funny. It'll come back to me. It's very important. Anyway, failure to rescue the Jews was something that the Jews that finally did make it to Palestine, um, it really registered with them. And the failure to rescue, even the failure to bomb Auschwitz, um, was that this was a this had huge, let's put it this way, it had huge implications for the settlers in Palestine. And they had come to know that Saudi Arabia strongly objected to the building of that one of those pipelines that Churchill's forces had been able to secure. I mean, the oil of Iraq, the pipeline that went to Haifa. That had to be a huge issue. It was debated in the FDR administration, and the real reason that the U.S. initially denied the bombing Auschwitz was that they knew that the survivors were going to go to Palestine, and Saudi Arabia, King Ibn Saud, which controlled most of the Middle East in that oil-rich area, he was objecting to settling, having this state. Um, and he said that American oil concessions would be threatened if this happened. And so during this narrow period of time, when some refugees were able to make it to Palestine, there was their slogan, no blood for oil. In other words, it would seem that the U.S. quest to control Saudi oil at all costs was more important than rescuing Jews. And I think that those who know this story, it's sort of a sword of Damocles over the head of the U.S. because it abandoned the Jews at a crucial time. And this would not be forgotten. The fact is that everything that's happened since the creation of the State of Israel is a tragic story. You know, the occupation, Palestine, and all the restrictions placed on it, and now people calling it an apartheid state. And fortunately, there are Jews who have really dug into the history and understand that there was a bigger reason for the creation of the State of Israel. It would be through huge supplies of armaments and finance. It would be the protector of American oil interests in the Middle East. And the pipeline ultimately ended in southern Lebanon, okay, very close to the border of Israel. But the fact that you had a heavily militarized Israel in the area was obviously deemed sufficient for American national security interests. And then when you look at the fact that there's $500 billion worth of oil and natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean and in part of Gaza and the West Bank, I predicted when I wrote this book that this was a tinderbox waiting to happen. Now we're in it. And yeah, I can go on and on. You want me to explain how the war in Gaza is influenced by oil and natural gas interests? Would you like me to go on that?
I have a couple of questions first.
Okay, fine.
You're talking about the Second World War, you know, what happened after the Second World War.
Yeah.
In Hitler's mind, was the oil fields prominent in his way that he conducted the war?
And the answer is yes. And there've been books written on it, actually. Yeah, if you look at how how he was moving his troops. For instance, the whole campaign in North Africa with Rommel, the famous general, leading German soldiers, and they were heading straight for the Eastern Mediterranean and the oil. That part isn't explained normally, right? But that whole crusade was Germany's effort, and there is a map that shows that it's about oil. And I don't think I put it in my book. I wish I did now, but that confirms what their interest was. They also wanted to get Russia's oil supplies, and particularly around Baku, that's Iraq. Um, this is before the Brits succeeded in getting the oil. Now, why is it? Why would this be a factor? Because as the Germans ruefully came to understand, you cannot be a major power and keep that position unless you know you have guaranteed oil supplies. And the reason you need guaranteed oil supplies is the military. It relies on oil, right? It's the fuel of the militaries, all the militaries in the world. So Germany lost World War I because its lorries and its tanks and whatever it was using at that time ran out of gas. Big lesson. And during World War II, Hitler, who was very aware of this indignity that happened to Germany, it wasn't going to happen again. And I just came back to the IG Farben plant that that had been bombed by the U.S. very close to Auschwitz, but Auschwitz was not bombed. The IG Farben plant was bombed, and they were trying to create artificial oil at that plant because Hitler knew. Thing is, Germany lost the war again. Why? They didn't have enough access to oil. So here we are. And the great game for oil continues. There's great pressure. Oh, there's great pressure to turn Israel into an energy corridor. Well, pressure, this is what Netanyahu wants more than anything else. Tap those huge reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean and run through pipelines and through Turkey, and that way supply Europe with oil and natural gas. So the end game, in my opinion, the reason why they're flattening Gaza is because they want to make that energy corridor at all costs. And we'll see. But it's very clear that the U.S. and Kushner, Trump's son-in-law,
Right.
and Saudi Arabia have big, big plans. So I went way beyond your question. Go ahead and ask another one if
Okay.
you want.
My other question is, in the early 2000s, when there was the first war in Iraq, our friend Scott Ritter said there were no weapons of mass destruction. Was that whole incident in Iraq back then? That did that whole thing have to deal with oil?
It was all about oil. It was all about oil.
Okay.
And by the way, Scott Ritter, I was on a show with him, and he confirmed what I was saying. All these conflicts are about oil and the quest for oil. You can talk all you want about all the political maneuverings and divisions and fights and the long history. All of that's valid. But what people aren't doing is looking at the underlying cause, which to my mind, the more they recognize that energy, big energy, is responsible for doing anything they can at all costs to control the oil of the region, and at all costs mean allow genocide to happen. I could author a piece on oil and genocide. I mean, I already wrote a book with my husband that was about that subject in Latin America. Thy Will Be Done. So, yes, the seizing the oil of Iraq was was the agenda for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and Netanyahu was championing for it. He very much wanted the U.S. to do it, and he was in collusion. And the plan was to topple Saddam Hussein and replace him with a Arab leader who approved, get this, of reopening that pipeline that runs from Iraq to Haifa. It had been closed in 48. It was built in the 30s, closed in 1948 because Iraq, which was then secular and nationalist, disapproved of it having a terminal point in Haifa. And so anyway, the idea was to put this guy named Ahmed Shalabi in power, and he favored the pipeline. And Netanyahu said right after the invasion of Iraq, you watch, the oil is going to be flowing to Haifa. This is not a pipe dream. Well, it was, and it still hasn't been built. But don't think that it isn't on the agenda. And the whole region, the whole reason for this what would I call it? Well, it's the great game for oil. I lost my train of thought, but anyway, that's what's behind it. And the reason you don't see it covered hardly ever, is because of the national security concerns. Everybody's out to get the oil, and we're not supposed to know who's doing it or why. But
Okay,
that's what's going on.
my next question.
Hmm.
There's the situation with the Ukraine right now, and
Mhm.
that's been going on for a couple of years. And Scott thinks it's a lot more dangerous than the situation in the Middle East. And it's been said that we are conducting a proxy war against against Russia. So the whole thing with the Ukraine, the bottom line with that conflict, would you say is oil?
Yes.
Because because
I,
because
I will, yeah, because what you want me to explain?
and
I wrote a piece all about it that said this could be the mother of all energy wars. Yeah.
okay,
So
but they're saying that this could lead to the blowing the whole world up due to with a nuclear war, and that's pretty frightening.
yeah, sure is. And we're so close to it. I mean, that the doomsday clock, I mean, we're like a minute away. This is very
Right.
serious. Yeah. So yeah, I wrote a long piece about, yeah, the mother of all energy wars. You can look it up. And I learned that Eastern Ukraine, the very area where Russia has got all its troops now, that's rich in oil and natural gas. Ukraine happens to be the second largest holder of oil and natural gas reserves after Russia in Europe. And there have been many efforts to figure out how they're going to tap this, and how are they going to distribute the oil and the natural gas. And so the eastern area has the most deposits, and that's where the Russian troops are situated. And I have this is an interesting article. It was written in 2000. That's the time when the oil is discovered off the coast of the Mediterranean. But this is titled Ukraine and the Caspian. Okay, it's a fascinating piece. It was put out by Rand Corporation. So just Google Ukraine and the Caspian, subtitle, an opportunity for the United States. And then subhead, Caspian oil, the US and Ukraine. And you go on reading this, and it's very clear that the Western powers want access, but they know that if they encroach on Russian interests, this is before the invasion, of course, there's going to be a problem. They knew this all along. It says here from this report, it is in part to avoid angering Russia that the US and NATO and its other members has steered clear of granting Ukraine any firm security commitments. A hardening of Russia's stance towards Ukraine could set off a dangerous chain reaction. A threatened Ukraine would have little choice but to ask for Western assistance. This would not only anger Russia, exacerbating the situation, but it would force an unwelcome choice for Brussels and Washington. For the U.S. and NATO, giving Ukraine the support it desires would invite conflict with Russia. So back in 2000, they were saying, well, look, how can we avoid a conflict with Russia? And then they start examining the oil in the Caspian Sea. There's another place rich with oil and natural gas, and in fact, it was perceived, certainly in the beginning of the Bush administration, that this hold on, I'm going to get this off. That was the Bush administration that understood this very well, and the idea was, hey, maybe Caspian Sea could have a pipeline that goes, across Ukraine, and it avoids all these networks that have already been built by the Soviet Union. They're old now. A lot of them need fixing up. But it's the Russian bypass game, okay? The Russians going to control this part, say, of Ukraine. We got to make sure that maybe we can get that Caspian oil and natural gas to European markets as long as we circumvent or avoid the Russians. And so it's all come to a head now. And of course, the bombing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the sabotaging of that, tells you everything, especially when it happened, which was the first sanction against Russia when it started to invade. And President Biden would make statements about how that pipeline cannot happen. He said so. And then shortly afterwards, it's sabotage. And, who did it? Well, some people say it's some group in Ukraine that did it. My guess is that's their proxies. But Ukraine is a proxy war. It's absolutely true. And I'm linking it to Gaza because the European nations are worried now that they're not getting Gazprom 2, which promised cheaper oil and natural gas than what the West provided. But that was sabotage. Now, I'm not sure if it's back on, but the U.S. Was able to pressure Germany to forget about their contract with Russia and the delivery of oil through Nord Stream 2. The German chancellor put an end to that, stopped that contract. It may come back again. I don't know if Russia gains more land to have leverage. But at any rate, that's what happened.
Wow.
They understood well. They considered running a pipeline, because if you look at the Caspian Sea, you got to look at the maps, okay? The Caspian Sea and the Black Sea are right in the middle of European countries. And there are all sorts of pipeline networks that are running. Russia ran 2 pipelines under the Black Sea. So it's all about who gets energy cheaply. And so I think the plan is to get it from Israel. So you need that corridor, but there can be no unrest because you will get no bank to support such a project if there's unrest. So, well, let's just wipe out Hamas, wipe out the Palestinians, set up security zones, and then you're off and running.
Wow. So, Charlotte, you've given our listeners a lot to digest with this, program. Let's stop now and I'm sure you have a lot more to talk about. So let's resume it at another date because what you're saying is important. The average person that watches MSNBC and CNN and Fox, they have no idea about this stuff you're talking about, and it's really important. So I'd like to resume this conversation when people have absorbed everything you said today. Would that
Well,
work for you?
that works for me. And of course, I could encourage people to buy the book because there's
Okay.
something like 10 pipeline maps in there that explain a lot about the conflicts. And you can get it on Amazon. What the hell? I mean, that seems how it's mostly sold, or your
Uh-huh.
local bookstore. Follow the pipelines. Follow the pipelines. Look at your maps. It all
Uh-huh.
makes sense. Thank you,
Okay, so
Cynthia.
it would be follow the pipeline, and you wrote it, Charlotte Dennett, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so Charlotte, thank you so much for being on Issues That Matter. You've been listening to Charlotte Dennett. I'm Cynthia Pooler. If you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube page and channel. I'm sorry. And most important, if you think what Charlotte said is really important, share it with a friend or relative. We've got to get this message out. Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a
Thank you,
great
Cynthia. Okay.